Hello and welcome to our presentation, On the Road, Working Towards Equity and Inclusion in Undergraduate Classes. From St. Olaf College, I am Lauren Kennedy and I am presenting with my colleague, Clare Wongwai. Our specific focus within the realm of racial and ethnic equity and inclusion is on the curriculum and pedagogy currently at play at St. Olaf College. For context, St. Olaf is a predominantly and historically white institution. Back in the spring of 2017, in response to the college's failure to address racism on campus, students protested to push the St. Olaf administration to act. In response to this, the SOAM 371 class, at the behest of the college, in the fall of 2017, looked at racial microaggressions in the St. Olaf classroom and curriculum. This previous fall of 2020, we built upon this research to see where St. Olaf was at today with regards to racial and ethnic equity and inclusion. As a small group, our particular focus has been on the curriculum and pedagogical practices currently used at St. Olaf. The questions we tried to answer are as follows. How often does course material, the topics, readings, discussions, and supplementary material include diverse non-Western voices which reflect students' identities within their major? How often do professors implement pedagogical practices in their classes to promote equity and inclusion? What changes in teaching practices do students recommend for improving inclusion and student comfort within classes? And what is the impact of having a shared racial and ethnic identity with the professor and/or a majority of the class have on a BIPOC student's feelings of inclusion within said class? For our presentation and for our research, we operated under the inclusion and equity definitions that can be found on the St. Olaf website. Inclusion is here defined as acts of creating opportunities for involvement, empowerment for underrepresented groups through which they can feel respected, supported, valued, and enabled to fully participate in campus life. Similarly, equity is defined as creating the conditions for all, including those from historically underrepresented groups, to achieve the same learning outcomes as members of the dominant groups. Our definition for racial microaggressions came from Daryl Wing Su et al., and it was everyday or ordinary degradations which can communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults. They can be intentional or unintentional and can take verbal, behavioral, or environmental forms.
We reviewed previous literature and found similar themes throughout the different publications. The main themes we encountered include number 1, examples of common racial microaggressions which BIPOC students are most affected by. Black college students have reported experiencing racial spotlighting, tokenizing, and feeling excluded during classroom discussions of race or ethnicity. These experiences lead to item number 2. As you can see, microaggressions can cause extensive harm to students' emotional well-being and their overall academic experience. Research also addresses the issues of exclusion of certain students, showing that Black students are more comfortable in a class taught by a Black professor in comparison to a white professor. BIPOC students also show a general discomfort if a professor lacks awareness on how to handle instances of racial microaggressions in the classroom. Theme number 3 involves how faculty implement inclusive and equitable practices in their classrooms and curriculums. Students benefited when their professors attended workshops focused on inclusive classroom practices. These studies illustrate how students were overall receptive to culturally responsive strategies that their professors utilized, which prompts and enhances their opportunities to learn and grow in a comfortable environment. Next slide, please. To gather data, we used an online anonymous survey where we randomly selected about half of the St. Olaf students. From here, we received responses from 305 students, which meets the general guideline for sample size and demographics. As you can see in number 3, we created both closed-ended and open-ended questions. Questions include various items and matrices that could be combined into an index. To analyze the data, we conducted univariate, bivariate, and some partial statistical analysis. Lastly, referring to number 5, it is important to note that we had to group all BIPOC students together into one category during the bivariate analysis. This is problematic because it puts groups of students together that are otherwise very different. However, this was the only way we could run our statistical analysis tests, as St. Olaf is a predominantly white institution. Next slide, please. In order to measure the feelings of inclusion students feel based on their identities, we asked about several conditions and whether these made them feel more comfortable and included. It's important to note that we included international students' responses together with domestic BIPOC students in our statistical analysis here, due to the important data that we received during our preliminary focus group. The first condition is whether the professor, one classmate, or more than half of their classmates share their racial or ethnic identities. Additionally, we asked if the department or the program of the course taken focuses on issues of race or ethnicity. Next slide, please. So how comfortable do students feel when these conditions are present? As you can see in the table of results, BIPOC domestic and international students were more likely to feel included as a result of having the mentioned conditions available. 53.7% of BIPOC students and 55.1% of BIPOC domestic and international students responded that they were more comfortable when these factors are present in their classes. In contrast, as you can see in the lowest row, 59.9% of white students did not report feeling more comfortable. Next slide, please.
We also looked at feelings of inclusion with regards to curriculum. Once again, we grouped domestic BIPOC students with international students, like Claire said, based on our preliminary research. It is important to note that there were statistical significant differences for all three of these questions. As we found, a large majority of survey respondents reported that the course topics within their respective majors helped them to feel more included in the classroom. However, white students were much more likely to agree as compared to international and domestic BIPOC students. Next, nearly 1 out of every 5 respondents agreed that the course readings in their respective major make them feel misrepresented. Unsurprisingly, white students were much more likely to disagree that course readings in their major make them feel misrepresented as compared to BIPOC and international students. Adding to this, among the students who responded to our open-ended question asking about one inclusive or equitable practice the student would like to see included, nearly 1/5 mentioned diversifying class materials, topics, and examples. Regarding course discussions of race and ethnicity within a student's major, a large majority of respondents disagreed that such discussions isolate them from their classmates. However, a substantial minority of BIPOC and international students did agree that within their major, they felt isolated from their classmates because of these discussions. In sum, these students' responses point to the need for professors to be better equipped to facilitate conversations regarding race and ethnicity, and that curriculum in all departments, including course topics, readings, and materials, needs to be inclusive and representative of all students. We also looked at what we called professor positives. These were frequency of factors promoting, in this case, inclusion in the classroom. These are factors that have been found in previous literature that have been seen to increase feelings of inclusivity and correlate to an overall more positive classroom experience. So we decided to look for the frequency of some of these factors at St. Olaf. As you can see in the red circle to your right, a large majority of students report that in 2 or more of their courses this previous semester has a professor promoted discussions about racism. And while we are certainly encouraged by the frequency of these reports, we believe that many of these discussions are not as productive as we'd hope they'd be, based on 18 different recommendations from student respondents requesting more open, more frequent, and less BIPOC-dependent discussions. One recommendation we received said, quote, "Spend more time on discussion than just preaching about it in once in one class. Be willing to have white students be uncomfortable," end quote. We know that these are not easy discussions, but it should not and does not need to fall upon BIPOC students. Beyond this, that it cannot just be one discussion, it needs to be a continuous conversation, hopefully throughout their time in undergrad, much less in one class. As you can see in the blue circle also to your right, a large majority of respondents report that professors are not being seen addressing microaggressions in class, which perhaps suggests that professors, particularly white professors, may not recognize microaggressions when they occur. Professors not recognizing and thus not addressing microaggressions, which we do know occur in our classrooms as addressed later in the study, which may convey to whomever the microaggressions are directed at that they are unwelcome in their class and that their comfort and inclusion are unimportant. Finally, as you can see in the green circle, although a large majority of students report that professors in 2 or more of their courses address connections between course materials and issues of race and ethnicity, still more than 1 in 5 students say this has only taken place in at most one of their classes this semester. We will need to note that there are no significant differences between domestic BIPOC and domestic white students reporting. We then summed these inclusive factors into an index. Of the 5 practices, we ended up with a total score between 0 and 20. And as you can see, the histogram is approximately normally distributed with a mean score of 8.91 and a standard deviation of 3.34. It is notable that the students' scores tend to cluster in the mid-range, while overall we'd have hoped to see them cluster near the right end. This indicates that professors see that their professors using some of these inclusive practices, but not a great number of them. We also like to note that there were no significant differences in the frequency reported by BIPOC students and by white students. As we said, ideally all the index scores would have been around 19 to 20, as we'd hope to see all professors using all of the inclusive practices that we asked about in their classes. As one respondent put it, quote, "To be an inclusive and equitable campus, the belief that all students and faculty are competent, capable, and essential to the fabric of our community and learning, not just to campus statistics, is necessary," end quote. As mentioned, we also looked about equitable practices. We'd like to call your attention to two of these, where we asked about the frequency in which students saw these professors utilize these listed equitable practices, which were generated and inspired from previous literature and through discussions with current professors at St. Olaf. As you can see in the blue circle, a slight majority of respondents said that professors used mostly or only course materials that are free in 2 or more of their courses. Yet nearly a quarter of respondents had this occur in none of their classes this fall. As you can see in the green circle, a majority of respondents reported that when a professor asked a question in class, they then called upon multiple students to answer in 2 or more of their classes. However, still 1 out of every 5 students reported that this had only occurred in at most 1 of their courses this previous fall. Previous research found that having professors require multiple students to answer the same question in class is an equitable practice because it removes the repetition of just one or just a few students' opinions and allows the professor a better idea of the class's knowledge, experiences, and views. Like with the inclusive practices, there were no significant differences in BIPOC and white student reporting for any of these factors. Once again, we compiled these into an index, which sums the 3 practices listed previously, assigning a total score between 0 and 12. The mean index score is 7.16 with a standard deviation of 2.39, and there's no significant differences between white and domestic BIPOC groups' reportings. Although ideally student scores would have clustered on the far right of the distribution, it is notable that, like in the inclusive index, they cluster in the mid-range instead. In sum, with regards to specific equity and inclusive practices, students were seeing about half of the practices that we asked about incorporated into their fall classes. While encouraging to see professors incorporate some of these practices, ideally we would have seen much higher index scores, especially since some of these practices, such as a verbal statement promoting inclusivity, are relatively easy to incorporate and may make a difference in the curricular experience of students.
In addition to the professor positives, which Lauren described, our research project also aimed to gauge the professor microaggressions. We asked students how many times they observed their professors do things like the items listed in the bubbles on the left side. Do professors question students' abilities based on their identities? Do they focus uninvited attention on students of color? Do they deny the possibility of being racist? Or have they stated or implied a racial, ethnic, or national stereotype about a group of people? When we take a look at the grid on the right side, we see through the red highlighted boxes that BIPOC domestic and BIPOC international students were more likely to report these incidents happening 1 or more times than their white domestic students did. Next slide, please. To address these issues of racial and ethnic inclusivity in curriculums and pedagogies highlighted by our survey results, we propose 4 recommendations to St. Olaf College, which might be useful for other campuses too. First, colleges should require or encourage professors to participate in ongoing anti-racism training programs that are centered around group reflection and collaboration with other faculty. Through having regular meetings where professors could voice their successes or struggles while trying to increase their inclusivity in classrooms, issues of race will be at the forefront of their mind. Recommendation number 2 is that professors should regularly allow and promote discussions that address racial issues that are directly or indirectly related to the course. For example, this would be a professor who discusses racial issues in their biology course. Having faculty that are willing to foster safe places where they and their students can address racism can mitigate the unnecessary pressures that BIPOC students face on a daily basis. The third recommendation is higher education institutions should require professors to go through a multi-step process before the start of each semester, where they can evaluate or reevaluate their course topics and materials. This requires professors to reflect on any possible insensitivities, misrepresentations, or stereotypes that they may be perpetuating and how they will address these in class. And lastly, number 4, the end of the semester course evaluations that students complete should include questions that gauge the professor's incorporation of inclusive practices. Evaluations assessing a professor's approaches provide constructive feedback while identifying specific areas for growth. This would be a valuable practice to implement for midterm evaluations as well. Last slide, please. Here are the sources we used and consulted for this presentation. Laura and I would like to thank you for attending.